Thank you so much to Fan and Lonnie for having me. Thanks to all of you. My dad grew up on the North Shore, so I feel like I'm in my home base right here. So I'm going to tell you, like Lonnie said, I'm going to give you the main argument behind the book. But before I do, I just want to give a little bit of context to who I am, humanize myself for a moment. At the core of my identity, I am a psychologist. So I know you guys are familiar with psychologists based on the other talks that you hear in this series, but just to be totally clear about the type of psychologist I am not. I'm not any of these types of psychologists, okay? So unable to diagnose anything clinical or tell anyone anything about their mother or the future. The type of psychology that informs my book, and my book is based on 15 years of my research, is research-based psychology. So what we do and what I'm going to be telling you about is based on surveys that we conduct where we ask people their preferences and their beliefs and their personality and their attitudes, and we alter things in the environment and see if their responses change. We study people's behaviors. When are people selfish or selfless? And I also continue to do a bit of neuroscience where we simply scan people's brains while they're making decisions and better understand the psychological processes driving their decisions. So everything that I'm going to tell you guys is scientifically proven and based in research, either my research or others. And the core topic that I'm going to tell you about, which again I've been studying for 15 years, is what I call humanization and dehumanization. And to define that for you, at the most basic level, humanization is just deep social engagement with another person. And then dehumanization is the opposite, failure to engage deeply with another person. To give you more of the jargon-based scientific definition, though, what I really mean by dehumanization is a failure to consider another person as having a mind, these invisible mental states, the capacity for thinking and feeling. So failing to consider another human being as having this inner mental life, that's what I mean by dehumanization, and then humanization is the opposite. Engagement with another person where we recognize them as having thoughts, feelings, desires, intentions, these invisible mental states beyond our appearance. And the main argument behind the book is that since the late 1960s at least, we've been experiencing what I'm calling a dehumanizing shift. That is this subtle form of dehumanization. Note, I'm not talking about dehumanization like we would think about in the context of the Holocaust or Rwandan warfare. This everyday dehumanization has been on the rise. And it would have been ideal for me to make this argument if someone had simply measured dehumanization directly since the last several decades. But instead I'm relying on a bunch of constructs related to dehumanization to make this argument. And this is probably not surprising to you. We hear this kind of anecdotally, that people are coming apart, people are very atomized, people are sort of separated from one another. But again, what's very important to me is that I give you the data to make this case. So the first place we can go to make this case is from data on empathy. So as luck would have it, college students since the late 1970s, at least until 2009, every year hundreds and thousands of them have been taking this survey that assesses empathy. And it assesses empathy in two ways. It asks you how inclined you are to experience empathic concern for another person, which is really asking you, how are you the type of person who tends to feel pain when you see another person in distress? And it also measures perspective taking. Are you the type of person that tries to see things from the other side's point of view? And these are basically empathic concern and perspective-taking scores amongst college students from the late 70s to closer to today, and you can see both are on a downward slope. Okay, so that's sort of data point one, that empathy and perspective-taking are declining, suggesting we are less deeply engaged with others' minds. Second piece of data I can give you comes from the General Social Survey, which is a nationally representative survey of Americans given every year. And since 1972, the National General Social Survey has asked this question: would you agree or disagree with the following statement? Most people can be trusted. What you see since the early 70s till at least a few years ago is that the percentage of people agreeing with this statement has also declined. In other words, general distrust of others has been on the rise, okay? So we see a decline in empathy, decline in general trust of others, and then we can also go directly to just pure socializing. Are people hanging out with each other as much as they were in previous decades? Here I can point you to data from late high school and early college students going back from the 1970s to today. This graph over here is the percentage of people saying they get together with their friends almost every day, clearly on the decline since the 1970s, and then since 1987, this is hours a week socializing with friends, partying, etc., as reported by college students entering, who are in their, are about to enter college from their last year of high school. And again, these are massive numbers of data, you know, hundreds of thousands of people, and you might think, okay, people are doing less in real life hanging out, but that's just because socializing has moved online, and that's part of the story. The problem is that if we also look at loneliness data from young adults, loneliness has spiked in the past 10 years amongst 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. And this issue of loneliness, I feel like we've been hearing about this decline or rise in loneliness for the past 20 years, and the data has really been not so clear, because if you were studying this in 2007, you would say, oh, it looks like loneliness is actually reducing. This is now the clearest data we have that in very recent years there's been a clear uptick. Okay, so all of this speaks to people coming apart. And this is not just a young person thing, although we see acute effects amongst young people, and by the way, particularly young women in the past 10 years. And I don't have an explanation for the gender difference, but I could speculate on that. Now, everything I've shown you so far is an American phenomenon, but if we look at the world as a whole, and I'm going to show you data from across the globe from a massive survey project called the World Values Survey that spans tons of different countries, virtually every country you could think of. Again, the font is pretty small, but that's just to show you there are a lot of them. We can see something beyond this American trend, which is that there's a worldwide trend toward what I'll call individualism. And individualism is just the idea that the self is kind of the most important thing, the self rather than the collective. So when you ask people about their values pertaining to individualism, you ask about pretty good things, like how important to you is personal choice and freedom of expression and every individual's right to express their own preferences. But the problem is, when people are saying, yes, these things are important, they're also saying, you know, what's less important is getting along with the group or doing what the group does, okay? So we could actually argue over whether or not this trend is a good or a bad thing. The only point I want to make is that it is a global trend. So since 1968, we see rising levels of individualism across the entire world, even in countries that are traditionally thought of as very collectivistic, like South Korea or most all Latin American countries, virtually. So these are countries where we would in the 1980s, we would say, oh, these are collectivistic countries. They care about the group more so than the self. Over time, virtually every country in the world has become more and more like the US, placing the self above everything. We've heard a lot about this generation me, that millennials are very self-interested, but this is in fact a global phenomenon that cuts across generations. Now, I want to say a word about individualism and how I think it's related to dehumanization, because individualism has brought with it so many positive things. What it's brought with it is tolerance of people from all walks of life. So part of this idea that we respect every individual's right to have a voice, to have a say, to have a choice, to express themselves means that we tolerate people from all different backgrounds, from all different countries, from all different persuasions. We're very tolerant. But the issue, I'll take some data off the screen now, can be best illustrated by giving you a snapshot of my neighborhood where I live on the north side of Chicago. Okay, so I live in a pocket of uptown Chicago called Buena Park. It's a very socially progressive neighborhood, the type of neighborhood where you would see lawn signs like these: Black Lives Matter, families belong together, hate has no home here, things like that. So all these socially progressive lawn signs that would preach tolerance. However, a few years ago, when there was a proposal to turn an apartment complex into a halfway house that would house people on their way home from rehab or prison, most people were opposed. And if you looked at some of the comments on the websites proposing this halfway house, it would be things like, well, I don't know what having this halfway house would do to the property value, or things like, well, there are kids in this neighborhood. We don't know the type of people who would be occupying this halfway house. And so to me, this perfectly represents the paradox of individualism, because I think it suggests that individualism says we tolerate everyone, we just don't necessarily want to engage with them. We don't want to live next to them. And that's where I think you get this subtle dehumanization, where we're more tolerant of people than ever before. And this is, again, a global phenomenon. This is a good thing. There have been massive advances in LGBTQIA rights, refugee rights, etc., but it's a very arm's length tolerance rather than a deep social engagement. And in the book, I point to sort of 4 markers of this dehumanizing shift. And I call them markers or pillars because I don't think they're either causes or consequences. They're both. They've both contributed to the dehumanizing shift, but they're also outgrowths of this dehumanizing shift. And I think where we see this evidence of this kind of divide is in 4 places. Okay, so one is probably very obvious to you, which is the rise of automation. I refer to automation just as the idea that every single process that we could think of, from asking directions to getting a movie review to identifying where's a good Italian restaurant that has gluten-free options, that has all been automated. Okay, when you hear the term automation these days, it refers to work often, but our entire lives have become automated, and what that means is that we're simply less reliant on other people. We're freed from other people to be quite independent. We don't need other people in the same way that we used to. So automation is one pillar of dehumanization. Social media, by the way, is not all bad. Okay, social media can have positive effects if you use it the right way, but the net effect of automation has been to free us from reliance on others. The second place where you see kind of evidence of this dehumanizing shift is in political polarization. Okay, again, unsurprising. This is simply the idea that people on the political left and the political right have become increasingly fractured and have less in common than in decades past. Not a new phenomenon, just a widening phenomenon. If you ask people in the 90s, Democrats and Republicans, do you approve of President Clinton? They'd be very split. On W. Bush, they'd be even more split, Obama even more split, and Trump the most split. So this is just a growing divide between the left and the right. Not surprising to any of you, we see this reflected in media and the way Congress votes and how general Democrats and Republicans amongst us think about the president. The third place where we see this kind of general divide is what I call stratification, but is more simply known as income inequality. And this simply speaks to the fact that as the wealth gap has increased between those lowest in socioeconomic status and those highest in socioeconomic status, people from low and high social classes, again, have less reason to see each other, less reason to hang out, less in common, from music preferences to food preferences to tendencies for things like smoking or not smoking. Again, this is simply another phenomenon of people coming apart. And so I think all three of these things you've been hearing about for a while. There's data to support that automation has picked up, that polarization has picked up in recent years. Thomas Piketty's book, Capital, was kind of the best data-driven argument that indeed income inequality has increased across the world, and it's not just due to somehow CEOs all of a sudden working 400 times more than their employees than in previous decades. And then the fourth one is a little fuzzier, so I want to unpack it a little bit. The fourth pillar is what I'm referring to as marketization. And the idea of marketization was put forth by Michael Sandel, who is a political philosopher at Harvard and wrote a book called What Money Can't Buy. And his argument, again backed up by good data, is that since the 1970s, free markets have crept into sort of every aspect of our life, okay? And he gives all sorts of examples on the pervasiveness of free markets for everything. And there's a reason, free markets are efficient and they do a lot of good for us, but he talks about how they've changed the way we relate to each other. And so he talks about there's free markets for kids reading books. There are certain schools that incentivize kids to read by paying them per book that they read. Or some cities, if you're a solo occupancy driver, you can pay to get access to the carpool lane. Or if you're wealthy enough, for some people, you can pay to have access to your physician's home phone number. So there are all these things that previously relied on communal norms. We try to help each other out, we try not to pollute, we try to get our kids good education, that are now placed in these sort of buyer-seller terms. And what does that do? It changes our relationships from ones based on community. You're a member of my community, I want to help you, you help me, to relationships based on this sort of instrumental exchange. What is your monetary worth to me? And I'll give you two extreme examples of this to illustrate this. So one extreme example comes from the South by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas. And the South by Southwest Festival is a festival for music and tech and film. And a few years ago, a marketing firm caught a lot of backlash because what they did was, this festival brings tens of thousands of people to Austin. What they did was they equipped homeless people, many of whom had been displaced by recent hurricanes, with a Wi-Fi router. And they had them wear these T-shirts that said, "Hi, I'm Clarence, I'm a Wi-Fi hotspot. You can go to this website, log on, and I will provide you with internet service." This guy was literally wearing a wireless router, okay? And you can see why the marketing firm caught backlash, because you're literally turning this person into a service. You're turning them into a product of sorts. And not only that, but this is a homeless person, already one of the most dehumanized classes in the US. Second extreme example of how this idea of markets for everything leads us to treat people as stores of value rather than as humans, comes from Disney World, where a few years ago, I believe this is, I don't think this is still the policy. There was a policy that if you had a handicap of some sorts, you could go to auxiliary line to get quicker access to the rides. And so the New York Post exposed that there was this ring of rich Manhattan moms who would actually hire handicapped tour guides to accompany them to the park so that they could cut the line, okay? And again, we know from research that disabled people are often dehumanized as well. This is also just placing kind of a dollar amount on them, further treating them as instrumental objects rather than human beings, okay? And this marketization one I think is tricky, but it's kind of entered into all facets of our lives, and how we talk about kind of things that used to be social goods now take on monetary terms. One just final example from my class that I teach at Kellogg. I teach a class on ethics, and of course it's business school, so we have to say, why does ethics matter? Well, ethics is good for the bottom line. And we'll talk about things like diversity. And a few years ago, I would have talked about the benefits of diversity. We know that diverse companies profit more, they attract a more diverse customer base, they're more innovative, they're more flexible. There's all these monetary benefits to diversity. And then it occurred to me while writing this book and doing some research on this that it's such a limiting way to think about something like diversity, which is really about equality, right? Diversity should be about giving every human being an opportunity. And if we only tie these things to kind of market value, we're losing the humanity of these social goods. So I've obviously put my cards on the table here. I think this trend that I've described to you is worth reversing. Not everyone would say that. They would say, individualism has brought us all this tolerance. It's brought us all this freedom of expression. It's brought us all these good things where we can celebrate the self. And I agree with a lot of that as well. But what I think it's done in the negative is that it's led us to live a less human existence. In other words, humans are less top of mind. Other humans are less top of mind than ever before. And so that's the argument driving the book, and I actually wanted to simply write a book on that trend. My book agent told me that it was too negative of a topic, and no one wants to buy a negative book. So then I spent actually years trying to figure out, well, what's the positive angle here? And the positive angle here is that humans actually matter. The most obvious reason why humans actually matter, I don't even talk about in the book until maybe the final 3 pages, in part because this was said much better by a mentor of mine, John Cassiopo. The most obvious reason why humans matter is because of social connection, which literally adds years to our lives. But I wanted to make an even more rudimentary argument that simply the presence of other people has all sorts of positive psychological effects. And in particular, I lay out 4. Okay, so 1, other people add meaning to our lives. They add morality to our lives. They move us to act in ways that we wouldn't have acted otherwise. They influence us, in other words. And they motivate us to work harder. And I'll go through each of these, okay? Now, meaning is a really broad category, okay? What I mean by humans give us meaning is that the presence of other human beings just makes our general experiences better, gives the general experiences of our lives more value. And I started by thinking about this in the context of human touch, all right? There are all these surprising studies about the power of human touch. And if you go back, centuries, there are all these stories or myths about the power of human touch. This is a depiction of this idea of royal touch, where it was believed that in the Middle Ages, English and French monarchs could heal people by touching them. We could probably think about even the Gospels in the New Testament or the King Midas story. There are all these fables about the power of human touch. But in fact, there's real data showing that holding another person's hand can actually make the experience of pain less severe. So they do these strange studies in the laboratory where they give you an electric shock in one hand, or they give you a severe heat pain with one hand, and you're either holding the hand of a loved one or not with the other hand. And the pain doesn't hurt so much when you're holding a loved one's hand. It can even be a stranger's hand, by the way. Loved one is even more of an analgesic, but a stranger will do the trick. There's all sorts of other studies about the power of human touch. People become more helpful when they're given a pat on the back or a handshake. Even basketball teams play more cooperatively to the extent that they're touching each other more. Some friends of mine at Yale School of Management watched a year's worth of NBA games, coded how often did the players touch each other on the court, giving each other fives and things like that, showed that these teams win more because they're actually more cooperative on the court. They pass the ball more, things like that. So there's all this power of human touch, and it turns out that human touch makes everyday objects and experiences more meaningful as well. In the age of automation, you'll note that the value of handmade goods has never been higher. There are all sorts of marketplaces like Etsy and Amazon Handmade for handmade goods because people actually value things with a human touch to be more made with love, to be more authentic, and to be more meaningful. People also value human labor. Okay, so there's a study done by some friends of mine at Harvard Business School that showed that people enjoyed food more when they saw people preparing their food with their hands, actually. They would take people to the school cafeteria where there was a sandwich making station, and they would either have them place their order for a sandwich, go over here and get the sandwich delivered to them, and then they asked them, how much do you enjoy the sandwich experience? Or they had you go like Subway, you order your sandwich, you watch the person make your sandwich, you get it at the end. And when people watched the human labor that went into the sandwich making process, they enjoyed the sandwich more. So again, the most mundane experience is enhanced by seeing the human labor behind it. And there's all sorts of examples of this. The ironic point behind this is that actually people will enjoy things sometimes if they wait in line longer because they're seeing or inferring the human effort behind it. There's studies of auctions, celebrity auctions, showing that people will pay more to the extent that an item from a celebrity auction, like the estate of Marilyn Monroe, was touched by the former owner. There's this idea that humans imbue their essence into all sorts of objects. And even a study by my friend Kurt Gray at North Carolina showed that a massage, sitting in an electric massage chair and getting a massage, if you believe the massage chair is being controlled by another human with a remote control, you actually experience more pleasure from the massage than if you think the machine is on autopilot. So these are all sorts of strange examples and a bit mundane, but the point is, when we recognize that there's human touch, human intention, human effort behind any product or process, we tend to get more value out of that process. Now, second, and related to this, is that humans, when we see the presence of another human being, it's a signal that we should act with moral care, that there's someone deserving of dignity and we should act with more care and compassion. But you don't have to even see a whole human. You could even just hear a human voice, see a human face, and that prompts us to behave with more morality. In fact, Honda, a few years ago, developed a motorcycle that intentionally resembled a human face. Okay? The idea behind this, they had done research, even brain imaging research, scanning people's brains, and they found that people responded to this grill similarly to how they responded to a human face. And the idea was that by putting this on the road, you would actually reduce accidents because people would take more care if they saw this on the road. This is also why, this power of humans to kind of generate a moral response. This is why if you're a charity, say an anti-hunger or anti-poverty charity, the best way you could advertise to get donations is to show a single human being, okay? This is an advertisement from Save the Children, all right? If you show even 2 human beings, 3, 4, 5, all of a sudden donations go down. And that's because there's nothing that resembles a human as much as a single human being. This is why Joseph Stalin was purported to say the death of a single Russian soldier is a tragedy, the death of 1 million is a statistic. He didn't actually say that, but you get the psychology behind that. A single human being, that pulls on us emotionally, but as soon as you have more than one, that's less human. That's a number. That's a statistic. So simple cues to humanity, faces, names, voice, make us respond with more compassion. Single individuals prompt more caretaking behavior than groups. Even animals that look more human-like are treated with more moral care and receive more money in terms of donation to wildlife causes for these species. So, between worm and chimpanzee, there's a lot of animals in the middle, some that are more resembling of humans, some that are less. And the more animals resemble humans, the more that prompts us to give money to their causes. Even, again, a very strange example from some Italian neuroscientists showed that if you prick a vegetable with a needle, people experience an empathic response towards that vegetable if you have named the vegetable, okay? So the idea is that they're actually doing this while monitoring people's brains' responses. They present people with a bunch of different vegetables that are poked with a needle, and either these vegetables have no names, or this is in Italy, so they, in the named condition, they would say, this is Giovanni, the carrot, or whatever, and they would poke it with the needle. As soon as the vegetable is given a human name, it's sort of a cue that we should respond with empathy, okay? I'm giving you the most far-out examples, again, to show you the power of these subtle cues to humanity. So humans create meaning, humans create morality, and humans also move us to act. They influence us. And again, this is of no surprise to you. This is what we talk about when we talk about conformity, right? Why do we do most things? Because other people do them. This is why McDonald's advertises trillions sold. This is why nightclubs artificially inflate their lines to make you feel like this is the place where everyone wants to be. And I describe in the book that other people get us to do things like vote, like reduce bullying at schools, in ways that are extremely impressive. Other people get us to engage in collective action. When we know that our friends vote, we're more likely to vote. If we know that our friends are against bullying, we're more against bullying. But here's the interesting part. The interesting part behind this component is that people consistently underestimate the power of humans to influence, okay? If you ask people, how influenced are you by others' opinions to do things, they would say not so much. But let me give you one experiment to show how people underestimate this. So this is a study of actually of energy conservation. So thousands of people are called on the phone in Southern California, and they're given this question. They said, we're interested in people's energy-saving behaviors. And when you think about reasons you might save energy at your home, how influential are each of the following reasons to save energy? How influential is the fact that you could protect the environment? They say from 1 to 5. How influential is this? How influential is the idea that you could benefit society by saving energy? How influential is the idea that you could save money? And how influential is the fact that your neighbors are saving energy as well? In other words, how influential are each of these reasons on your decisions to save energy? And if we look at these different reasons, protecting the environment, benefiting society, saving money, or social norms, the fact that your neighbors are saving energy, people would say that protecting the environment has the most influence on their behavior. So then these same researchers who called up thousands of people on the phone, they actually go to tons of neighborhoods in Southern California, and they put various door tags on people's doors. Now, some doors they don't put door tags on. These are the comparison doors. But other doors, they place different signs on the doors, and they give a different reason. They say, we would like you to save energy. They would give people different reasons varying with the questions that I just showed you. So some signs would say, please save energy to protect the environment, please save energy to benefit society, please save energy to save money, or please save energy, your neighbors are saving energy as well. And then they actually got access to these houses' energy consumption records over a period of several weeks. And they said, okay, well, which of the signs were the most effective? This axis here is how much energy was consumed per day. So higher numbers mean more energy used. So this is no sign versus protecting the environment, benefiting society, saving money, and social norm. And what you can see is that despite people over the phone saying that my neighbor saving energy has the least amount of influence on my decision to save energy, in fact, in practice, it had the most influence. Okay, and this is something we see over and over again, particularly with regard to these kind of collective action behaviors. All right? Why do people do things that benefit the collective? Because they see other people doing them. But if you ask them, why are you doing this? They would say, oh, I'm doing it for pragmatic reasons. All right? So that's the power of humans to influence us. Now, the final reason why humans are psychologically important is because they motivate us. All right? And they motivate us to work harder in ways beyond what we would do just to benefit ourselves alone. You know, I have to really be persuasive to my MBA students when I tell them about this, that oftentimes people work harder on behalf of other people than they do for an increase in pay. Okay? And the first person I ever knew who was studying this phenomenon was a guy I went to grad school with named Yi Li. And Yi is a professor at California, Riverside. And he was studying this in graduate school. You would do these very simple studies where you'd give people a very boring task, like here's a bunch of pages of legal text. We want you to circle every T on the page. And for every T you circle, for some people, you'd say, we'll give you a dime, okay? So for every T you circle, you get a dime. Or he'd say, for every T you circle, we'll give the next person in the study a dime. And you had the opportunity to make a good amount of money or make another person, a stranger, a lot of money. And he found consistently that people would work harder when they had an opportunity to make other people money than themselves, which makes no economic sense, but it's why we often find that people work harder when they know that their company has a charitable giving program or a corporate social responsibility program. People like when their own companies benefit other humans, okay? Even Credit Suisse, this big bank, they made it a rule that every banker has to give, I think, 10% of their bonuses away every year to charity, and people love those, okay? Because they feel like, okay, my work in some way benefits another human being. Now, the way I can better explain this, and how Yi, my friend in grad school, explained this to me, is he called this phenomenon the James Bond effect, this idea that people would be more motivated to do things on behalf of others than themselves. And why did he call this the James Bond effect? Well, some of you might recall there's the old trope in the Bond movies where Bond is captured by the villain, and he's tied up, and he's told, give me the key, give me the code, give me the diamond, or else I'm going to torture you. And Bond says, you can torture me all you want, I'm never going to tell. All right? But at just that moment, then the villain produces Bond's girlfriend and says, well, give me the secret or I'll torture her, and Bond leaps into action, okay? So again, the psychology here is that oftentimes we are more motivated to do things to benefit another person than we would ourselves. And again, this is why people often work harder on behalf of others than they will for personal gain. People like when their companies benefit social causes, and people are happier when their work results in helping others versus helping themselves. So this is all part one of the book. The rest of the argument is what to do with this, okay? And I'll give you just a little bit on what to do with all this, because the rest of the argument is taking all of the psychology behind why it's important to keep humans top of mind and what good are humans psychologically, even beyond social connection, beyond friendship, okay? Which others have touched on better than I could. Just the simple presence of humans does all of these important things. So then how do we incorporate this into our daily lives? So I think about 4 different domains. One of which is the workplace, all right? And when we think about work in the age of automation, the question is how to make people feel like they're not replaceable. And I lay out, there are a couple things that humans can do better than robots still. We want to nurture those things, but also part of making people feel more human at work is prioritizing their leisure and letting them get away from work, detaching our identities from work. This is a very American thing I've learned, that we place so much of our personal identity in our work. The second domain I think about is interactions with technology. How do we retain our humanity when we're kind of forced to interact with technology all the time? I was talking with some Silicon Valley venture capitalists for this book, and he was saying, no longer do we decide whether we want new technology. Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg decide for us. So I've sort of given up. I can't fight it. And so I talk about how we can more effectively partner with technology and design technology to optimize human engagement. Third domain I talk about is conflict, specifically a lot of ideological or ethnic conflict. And how do we bring more humanity to these conflict situations? The long story short is that unity on its own isn't enough. Okay, it's not enough for us to say, let's just bring people together. What's more important is to recognize that it's okay that we have differences, and we need to embrace those differences, particularly differences pertaining to power, before we bring people together. Be accepting of differences when we bring people together. A lot of people would say, well, let's just focus on common humanity up front. I think it's very important to identify, well, what are the differences before we get to that common humanity point. And then the fourth domain is how do we rehumanize our close relationships? And this one is a little counterintuitive because, if anything, our close relationships with our friends and families, we're very identified with people and we recognize our closest others as humans, but we often treat our friends and family as a replication of the self rather than as a distinct human being. And so what I talk about there is the importance of, actually, Alcoholics Anonymous has this great term that I discovered in researching this book called detaching with love, okay? It's the idea of recognizing our closest others' humanity and recognizing that they're a distinct human from ourselves. So that's sort of my tantalizing preview for the rest of the book, but I think it would be a good time to take some questions. So thank you guys very much.